He felt that familiar, cold whisper in the back of his mind, that bloodlust he fought to suppress, urging him to embrace the chaos rather than fear it. Miles away in the ravine, Belphoebe Balthazar, the solitary leopardess who had been tracking the coalition's movements, crouched in the jagged shadows of an acacia root. She watched through narrowed amber eyes as Titus and two of his lieutenants, Grog and Mute, fanned out in a pincer formation to intercept the musketeers. Belphoebe shifted, her claws digging into the dry earth. She had no loyalty to these lions, but she knew that if Titus consolidated power, her own territory would be obliterated. She caught sight of Scipio rounding the bend, his head held high, completely exposed. She considered letting them fall, but her survival instinct was sharper than her cynicism. She let out a sharp, bird-like screech, a warning signal, before melting deeper into the shadows, a ghost in the brush. Back at the plateau, Scarface didn't wait. He moved with a silent, terrifying grace. As he reached the ravine, the ambush triggered. Titus launched himself at Scipio, claws extended, while Grog and Mute blocked the path to Marani and Hunter. "Brother, get back!" Scipio roared, skidding on the loose shale to dodge a swipe that shredded the air where his throat had been a second before. Scarface intercepted the flow of battle with an impact that shook the ground. He didn't just run. He arrived like a collapsing storm. He stood between the three enemies and his kin, his mane bristling, his presence so heavy it seemed to warp the very air. Titus snarled, hesitant for a heartbeat, his resolve wavering in the face of the unnatural gravity radiating from Scarface. "You want blood?" Scarface roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Then take it from me!" Titus attacked first, but Scarface sidestepped, his shoulder checking the larger lion with such force that Titus tumbled sideways. Grog lunged for Scarface's flank, but Scarface spun, catching Grog's neck in a brutal, locking bite that sent the usurper spiraling backward into the ravine wall. Mute tried to circle, but Scarface lashed out, a precise, devastating blow that opened a gash along Mute's chest. The battle was a blur of teeth and dust. Scarface was a whirlwind of calculated violence, his every movement a testament to his desperation to keep his brothers whole. He took a heavy swipe to his shoulder, the skin splitting, but he didn't falter. He stood as a pillar, a fortress of fur and muscle, forcing the three lions to recoil. Titus rose, panting, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and primal fear. "You are not a king," Titus spat, backing away as Scarface advanced, his posture radiating an authority that silenced the very wind. "I am the wall you will never break." Scarface growled, his gaze cold, the internal voice finally falling silent in the face of absolute, singular purpose. As the rain began to fall, turning the dust into slick mud, he looked back at his brothers alive, breathing, and standing behind him, and knew that the price of their lives was a toll he would pay every single day until his last breath. Scene 22, deepening the brotherhood. The Mara River churned with the silt of 1,000 upstream disturbances, but beneath the overhanging fever trees, silence held the brothers in a suffocating grip. Scarface stared at his reflection in a stagnant puddle, the jagged ridge of skin above his right eye, a map of past failures, pulsed with a dull ache. He forced his jaw to unclench, though the phantom voice, that cold, rhythmic whisper of bloodlust, clawed at the back of his mind. "We are not ghosts yet," Scarface said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that rattled the dry grass. Scipio shifted his weight, his shoulder dripping with dried mud from the morning's skirmish. "The kings think we are. They left the territory borders open, thinking we lacked the strength to return." Marani let out a sharp, jagged huff of breath, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun bled orange into the dirt. "They think we are boys playing in the dust. They don't see the metal behind our eyes." Hunter, the youngest, limped closer, his tail flicking with nervous, rhythmic energy. He looked at his brothers, searching for a sign of the uncertainty he felt blooming in his own chest. "If we go back, we go as a storm, not as beggars." Scarface stood, his frame casting a long, heavy shadow across the brothers. "We go to finish the work our mother began. No mercy for the ones who watched us starve." Miles away, near the jagged granite outcrops of the northern ridge, Belphoebe Balthazar observed the scene from a hidden ledge. She was not alone. Near her, Casey, a scarred lioness, who had long ago learned that loyalty was a luxury, sharpened her claws against a quartz protrusion. Cassie's eyes darted toward the valley, watching the smoke of a distant brush fire. "The musketeers are moving," Cassie whispered, her ears pinned flat. "The kings have grown lazy. They've forgotten the weight of a true challenge." Belphoebe didn't blink. She watched the shifting patterns of the wind through the tall grass, her mind calculating the distance between the brothers and the king's stronghold. "They haven't forgotten, Cassie. They're arrogant. Arrogance is a flaw that even the strongest steel can pierce." "Do we interfere?" Cassie asked, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and opportunism. "We wait," Belphoebe replied, her gaze cold and detached. "Let the brothers break the kings first. We are not survivors because we jump into the fire. We are survivors because we let others burn until the way is clear." Back in the thickets, the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and impending rain. Scarface approached each brother, pressing his forehead firmly against theirs in a silent, grounding ritual. The contact was electric, a transfer of resolve that bypassed the need for empty words. "Tonight," Scarface stated, his eyes locking onto Hunter's with a fierce, unwavering intensity, "we stop playing at Brotherhood. We become the inevitable." Hunter nodded, his trembling subsiding as he felt the collective heartbeat of the group, a rhythmic, drum-like pulse that mirrored his own. Sicchio and Marani stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of muscle and unspoken pacts. They were a singular entity now, tempered by the loss of their past and the promise of a brutal, unforgiving future. "They will learn," Marani growled, his gaze fixed on the dark silhouettes gathering on the ridge, "that when you push the desperate, you only sharpen their teeth." Scarface turned his back on the setting sun, his silhouette looming large against the darkening savanna. The voice in his mind flared, demanding violence, but he muffled it with a single, grounding thought. They were 4 parts of one blade, and the kings would be the first to know the edge. "Let the night be our witness," Scarface whispered. "We take everything, or we leave nothing behind." Scene 23. The King's Desperate Call. The Mara River churned with the color of wet slate, the air thick with the smell of rotted lilies and impending thunder. Scarface stood at the water's edge, his massive paws sinking into the cooling mud, watching a dragonfly dart over the surface. Right beside him, Sicchio, Marani, and Hunter moved with synchronized, silent tension. They were 4 statues of golden fur and battle-hardened muscle, their breath rhythmic and cold. "The air tastes like iron," Sicchio rumbled, his ears twitching at a distant, unsettling vibration in the earth. "The Marsh King is desperate. He sends emissaries instead of coming himself." From the tall reeds emerged 2 scarred, aging lions envoys of the usurper kings who held the northern grasslands. They kept their distance, their tails flicking nervously. One of them, a lion named Kojo, stepped forward, his voice cracking with feigned authority. "The king offers a pact," Kojo announced, though his gaze darted to the musketeers' scarred flanks. "The marsh is vast. Join him, and your territory will stretch to the horizon. No more fighting." Scarface let out a low, vibrating sound that seemed to rattle the very silt at their feet. "We do not take crumbs from tyrants," Scarface replied, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of a mountain. "We do not accept alliances built on blood we have already claimed." Belphoebe Balthazar watched from a ridge 100 yards away, her eyes narrow and sharp. She had spent the last 2 days stalking the movements of these envoys, marveling at the sheer gravity the 4 brothers commanded. She saw the way the wind bent around Scarface, as if even the elements deferred to his presence. She felt the urge to intervene, to solidify her own standing by guiding the brothers into a tactical trap for the king, but she hesitated. Her independence was her only armor in this brutal landscape. If she joined them, would she be a partner or just another piece of their rising empire? Down by the marsh, Marani didn't wait for another word. He lunged, a blur of golden aggression. The envoys scrambled, panic breaking their disciplined facade. Hunter and Sicchio moved to flank them, their coordination flawless. "Run back to your king," Hunter roared, slamming his shoulder into Kojo and sending him sprawling into the sucking mud. "Tell him the musketeers walk their own path." The battle was short and brutal. Scarface didn't need to strike. His mere presence kept the envoys stumbling over their own feet. He swiped once, his claws leaving a searing mark across the second envoy's flank, a message etched in flesh. They scrambled away, fleeing into the depths of the marsh, their whimpers lost in the rising wind. Elsewhere, deep in the thicket of the lower valley, a rival hyena pack watched the skirmish from afar. The matriarch Nala hissed at her kin. "They grow stronger," she muttered, her eyes reflecting the lightning flickering on the horizon. "The kings are failing. If the brothers reject the pact, the chaos will be total. We prepare for the harvest." Her subordinates chattered nervously, their loyalty wavering between fear of the lions and the promise of the coming upheaval. Back at the river, the brothers regrouped. Scarface looked toward the dark clouds gathering over the marsh. "The voice," he whispered, mostly to himself, a flicker of doubt passing through his stoic mask. "It grows louder. It demands more than just survival." Scipio bumped his shoulder against Scarface's, a silent reminder of their bond. They stood alone, four silhouettes against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the wild, knowing that the kings would not send envoys again. The time for talk had passed. The time for the throne was beginning. "We are all that matters," Hunter said, his voice hard and absolute. "Let the kings call. We are the answer they fear." Scene 24 Scavenger Network Expansion. The heat shimmering off the Mara plains turned the horizon into a distorted, liquid haze, mirroring the internal agitation clawing at Marani's chest. He paced the perimeter of the tall grass, his paws silent against the scorched earth. The air tasted of dry dust and impending violence. His brother, Scarface, was miles away, likely lost in the maddening cacophony of that phantom voice, but Marani had a different hunger, the acquisition of the pride. Belphoebe Balthazar sat nearby, her golden eyes tracking the movement of the king's sentries with a cold, analytical precision. She remained motionless, a silhouette of defiance against the shimmering heat. "The sentries are sluggish," she murmured, her voice like grinding shale. "The king's reign is not just failing, Marani, it is rotting from the inside." Marani stopped pacing, his gaze locked on the distant pride cluster. "Rot needs to be cleared, Belphoebe. I am simply providing the catalyst." "You want more than territory," she countered, shifting her weight. "You want them to invite you in. You want to be their savior, not their conqueror. It's a dangerous game for a beast who trusts only his brothers." Marani didn't answer. He turned his attention to the periphery, where Scipio and Hunter were quietly corralling a group of hyenas, forcing them into a brutal, one-sided conflict. The sounds of snapping bone and high-pitched yelps echoed across the scrub, a rhythmic, violent percussion that served as the heartbeat of their expansion. Elsewhere, deep within the shade of a twisted acacia grove, the lioness Zola stood tense as the two older, battle-scarred guards of the king hissed commands at her. They were restless, their manes matted with burrs and old blood. "The musketeers are pushing the borders again," the larger guard spat, his claws raking the dirt. "If you do not drive them back, the king will hold you responsible for the loss of the southern wells." Zola looked at the guards, then back toward the horizon, where she knew the brothers were closing in. "The wells are dry, and the prey has migrated," she said, her voice steady. "We are hungry, and you speak of duty. Perhaps it is not the musketeers who have failed us, but the crown." The guards lunged, their jaws snapping inches from her throat, but Zola didn't flinch. She had seen the way Marani moved, the calculated grace of his strikes. The fear that once governed the pride was being replaced by a burgeoning, dangerous curiosity. Back in the tall grass, Marani watched the scene unfold from afar. He saw the shift in Zola's posture, the way the guards hesitated when they realized their threats no longer carried the weight of absolute death. "They are listening, Marani," Belphoebe noted, her tone devoid of comfort. "But once you break their loyalty, you take on the burden of their survival. Is your brother ready for that?" Marani bared his teeth, the scars across his muzzle tightening as he felt the familiar, cold pressure of his own ambition. "He doesn't have to be ready. He only has to be standing." He signaled to Hunter, who emerged from the dust of the hyena skirmish, his fur matted with gray soil. There was no joy in their brotherhood, only the relentless, grinding gears of a war that demanded everything. The air grew still, the silence between them stretching into a heavy, suffocating blanket as they prepared to move against the pride's flank. "The king thinks he leads a house," Marani whispered to the wind, his eyes burning with the certainty of an encroaching storm. "But he's just sitting on a pile of kindling." Scene 25, Battle of the High Ridge. Why do they keep climbing, knowing we are already at the summit? Marani asked, his voice low and vibrating like a gathering storm. He shifted his weight, his heavy paws pressing into the loose shale of the high ridge. Above them, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a deluge that would turn the mountain pass into a slick, lethal slide. Scarface didn't look back. His eyes, fixed on the three nomadic lions creeping up the narrow goat trail, burned with a cold, tactical fire. Desperation smells like rot, Scarface replied, his muscles bunching beneath his tawny hide. They don't want the land. They want to believe they are the ones who can take it. The first nomad, a scrawny male with a jagged notch in his left ear, lunged. Scarface moved with a fluid, terrifying economy of motion. He sidestepped the nomad's frantic swipe, hooked a claw into the intruder's shoulder, and used the nomad's own momentum to heave him into the path of Hunter. Hunter didn't hesitate. He slammed his massive frame into the nomad, driving him into the jagged limestone wall. The sound of bone against rock was sickeningly crisp. 100 yards down the ridge, Belphoebe Balthazar watched from the shadows of an acacia thicket. She was not alone. Near her, the aged leopardess Seraphina and the opportunistic hyena matriarch Grendel paced, their own agendas clashing with the chaos above. They are going to kill them all, Seraphina hissed, her tail twitching in rhythmic agitation. Look at them. It's not just a fight, it's an erasure. Grendel let out a sharp, clicking laugh. Let them exhaust themselves. While the brothers bleed, the pass opens for us. My pack is hungry, and a weakened king is just a buffet that hasn't realized it's dead yet. Belphoebe ignored the hyena, her gaze locked on Scarface. She felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of her own choice to remain the independent observer or to step into the reach of the brothers' dominion. He isn't fighting for the land, Belphoebe whispered to herself, noting how Scarface paused, his ears twitching as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. He's fighting the shadows in his own mind. Back on the ridge, the second nomad attempted a desperate flanking maneuver. Sikio intercepted him, a roar erupting from his chest that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath their feet. The nomad recoiled, eyes widening, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of Sikio's presence. Sikio pinned him, teeth bared, holding the intruder inches from the precipice. Gravity is a harsh judge, Sikio growled, before tossing the nomad aside like a discarded pelt. The final intruder, a massive brute with matted fur, turned to flee, but Scarface surged forward. He didn't just attack, he dictated the rhythm of the end. He slammed his forehead into the nomad's jaw, then delivered a series of precise, punishing blows that sent the intruder tumbling backward down the treacherous incline. The nomad didn't stand up again. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whistling wind whipping through the pass. Scarface stood at the edge, his chest heaving, his gaze piercing through the gathering mist. He felt that familiar, chilling hum in his ears, the voice, the call of the bloodlust, but he smothered it with the sight of his brothers standing firm beside him. "The pass is held," Hunter called out, his voice echoing against the rock faces. Scarface turned to his kin, his expression unreadable. "It is held today, but the mountain does not forget the price of the blood spilled upon it." He looked toward the thicket where he knew the others watched, his eyes meeting the cold, analytical stare of Belphoebe. "Is it enough to just survive the climb, or must we eventually become the mountain itself?" Scene 26. The whispers intensify. Does the wind always sound like a dying gasp to you, or is it just the height of these cliffs? Scarface asked, his gaze fixed on the jagged, sun-bleached horizon of the King's Bastion. Sikio shifted his weight, the rhythmic twitch of his tail the only sign of his agitation. "It sounds like rocks grinding against each other, brother. You've been staring at nothing for an hour. The brothers are restless. Hunter and Marani are sharpening their claws on the acacia bark just to have something to do." Scarface didn't blink. The voice, the low, vibrating hum that echoed not in his ears but behind his teeth, was screaming of a coming red rain. "The cost is absolute," it hissed. "To rule is to hollow out your own soul." He pressed his forehead against the cold granite, his scar throbbing in rhythm with the phantom static. "It's not nothing, Sikio. It's the final calculation." A few hundred yards below the ridge, Belphoebe Balthazar sat amidst a cluster of jagged boulders, her ears swiveling to catch the distant, frantic chatter of baboons. She was not alone. Nearby, the scavenger Kretch, a limping, battle-scarred hyena with one clouded eye, was frantically digging a hole, his breath ragged and uneven. "Stop digging, Kretch," Belphoebe said, her voice dripping with a dry, jagged cynicism. "You're looking for a meal in a place that has been picked clean by the vultures. Even the beetles have moved on." Kretch paused, panting, his tongue lolling. "The kings, they don't let anything go to waste. If they take the bastion, the scraps will be worth the risk, won't they, Balthazar? You keep watching those lions like you're waiting for them to turn into smoke." Belphoebe let out a sharp, dismissive chuff. "I'm watching them to see if they're worth the gamble. Independence is a heavy coat to wear in this heat, but I'd rather starve than bow to those two tyrants on the throne." She flicked her tail toward the bastion. "If Scarface breaks their lines, the hierarchy resets. That is when I act." Back on the ridge, the tension reached a snapping point. Hunter lunged forward, his heavy paws slamming into the dirt as he circled Scarface. "We aren't statues. We are the storm that brings the collapse. If you are waiting for a sign from the sky, look at our claws. That is your sign." Morani trotted up behind, his mane bristling like electrified wire. "He's been hearing the voices again," Morani noted, his tone devoid of judgment, only a grim, pragmatic fatigue. "The price of the crown is already paid, Scar. We don't have to talk about it anymore. We just have to execute." Scarface finally turned, his golden eyes burning with an unsettling, focused clarity. He looked at his brothers, the only tether he had to the earth, and then glanced down toward the rocks, where he knew the observer, Belphoebe, was watching. He felt the weight of the sky, voices warning. Victory is merely the beginning of the end. "We march at moonrise," Scarface said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant rumble that seemed to stop the very breath of the surrounding scrubland. "We do not fight for the land. We fight because there is no other path. If the cost is our blood, then let the earth drink its fill." Sikio bared his teeth in a grim smile. "That's the brother I know. No more waiting." Down below, Belphoebe stood, her muscles coiled with potential energy, watching the four silhouettes loom large against the darkening sky. She knew the chaos was coming, and she wondered, if only for a fleeting second, if the lions were truly as invulnerable as their shadow suggested, or if she was merely watching a tragedy unfold from the front row. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of iron and ozone, and for the first time she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. "They are going to burn it all down," she whispered to the empty, darkening plains, "and we are all going to have to find a way to survive the smoke." Scene 27. Assault on the Bastion. The air in the reeds was thick enough to chew, a humid curtain of rotted vegetation and heat. Scarface crouched, his golden fur matted with the dust of a dozen skirmishes. He stared at a single stalk of bent grass, his breathing shallow. Beside him, Sikio was picking a stubborn thorn from his paw with agonizing slowness. "The wind is turning," Sikio muttered, not looking up. "The kings have scented us. They aren't waiting for the dawn." Scarface didn't blink. "They want a theater. We will give them a tragedy." The silence stretched, heavy as an anvil. Morani and Hunter shifted behind them, their muscles bunching like coiled cables. They were the brothers, the only law that mattered in this wasteland. A mile away, near the bastion's perimeter, Belphoebe Balthazar paced the perimeter of a jagged rock shelf. She was not with the brothers, and she preferred it that way. Below her, three rival scouts, cunning, scarred males loyal to the current tyrants, huddled near a muddy creek. They were whispering, their tails twitching with anxious energy. "The four of them are ghosts," one scout hissed, his voice like grinding gravel. "They moved through the gorge without disturbing a single leaf." "They are just lions," another replied, though his paws trembled. "Kings are gods. Gods do not bleed." Belphoebe watched them from the heights, her ears swiveling to catch every syllable. She felt the tug of self-preservation. If she walked down there, if she signaled them, she could secure a place in the new order. But her independence felt like a physical weight in her chest. She stood tall, a silhouette of defiance against the blood-orange sky, and let out a sharp, dismissive chuff that caused the scouts to freeze and look toward the shadows, eyes wide with terror. Back at the reed bank, the sudden roar of an enemy patrol shattered the quiet. Scarface exploded into motion. He didn't run, he blurred. He slammed into the lead guardian with the force of a falling boulder, jaws clamping onto the rival's thick mane, dragging him down into the sludge. "Now!" Scarface roared. The brothers moved as a single organism. Hunter intercepted two attackers, his claws slicing through the air, hooking into flesh with a sickening thud. He shoved one against the jagged stone, his voice a low, guttural growl. "You chose the wrong side of the river." Marani was a whirlwind of violence, parrying a lunging blow and returning it with a heavy strike that sent his opponent sprawling into the reeds. The violence was precise, rhythmic, and utterly relentless. There was no room for hesitation, no room for regret. Scarface stood over the fallen king's lieutenant, his eyes glowing with that familiar, dark intensity. The voice in his head, that cold, seductive bloodlust whispered for him to finish the slaughter. He shook his mane, fighting the urge to surrender to it. He pinned the beast down, his gaze locking with the terrified animal beneath him. "We are not here for your lives," Scarface rasped, his voice echoing over the snapping of reeds. "We are here for the crown." The bastion itself trembled as the brothers surged forward, their presence creating a vacuum of fear that forced even the most hardened warriors to scramble backward. They didn't need numbers, they had the weight of their own history. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the battlefield in streaks of violent crimson, the brothers stood atop the leveled reeds. The kings were trapped in their stronghold, and the path was cleared. Scarface looked at his brothers, Sicchio's torn ear, Marani's labored breath, Hunter's fierce, unwavering stare. "The brothers are the only alliance," Scarface whispered, a profound sense of brotherhood washing away the madness for a fleeting, sacred moment. They didn't need words to reconcile the scars they had earned. Far above, Belphoebe watched the smoke rise, her heart hammering against her ribs. She understood now that some paths were not chosen, but forged in the fire of others' battles. She turned her back on the bastion, choosing to remain the ghost in the machine, thinking, "Freedom is a cold companion, but at least it is mine to hold." Scene 28, The Downfall of Tyranny. The marsh reeds bowed under a heavy, stagnant heat, smelling of sulfur and wet decay. Scarface stood at the edge of the stagnant pool, his paws sinking into the mire with rhythmic precision. Beside him, Sicchio, Marani, and Hunter were mere shadows of muscle and intent, their breathing synchronized into a singular, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the mud. "He knows we are here," Scarface said, his voice a gravelly rasp that cut through the silence. He did not look at his brothers. He watched the ripple in the water where the Marsh King, a scarred, aging titan with a mane matted by dried mud and blood, waited. Sicchio shifted, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant scavenger bird. "He's tired, brother. Look at the way he drags his left haunch. The swamp has already claimed his spirit." "Spirit is irrelevant," Marani interjected, his eyes burning with a cold, tactical hunger. "He has the position. We have the numbers. Don't let his exhaustion fool you into a slow death." In the tall grass a mile north, Belphoebe Balthazar watched from a ridge, her breath steady. She was accompanied by a small, nervous band of hyenas who had long ago traded loyalty for the chance to scavenge the aftermath of the Musketeers' wars. "Keep your heads down," she commanded, her tone sharp. "If the king falls, the power vacuum will be a throat cutter. If he wins, we are ghosts." The Marsh King emerged from the reeds, his bulk monstrous, a wall of fur and ancient fury. He roared, a sound of pure, hollowed-out tyranny, shaking the very earth. Scarface didn't wait. He launched himself, a golden blur of kinetic violence. He slammed into the king's shoulder, teeth sinking deep into the older male's neck, pinning him against the jagged roots of a dead acacia. The king thrashed, his claws raking bloody furrows across Scarface's ribs, but the musketeers were already there. Sicchio dived for the king's hindquarters, his jaws locking onto the hamstring with a sickening crunch. Marani and Hunter flanked from the left, their movements a seamless dance of tactical cruelty. Hunter delivered a brutal strike to the king's jaw, knocking the older lion back, while Marani clamped his teeth onto the king's throat, suffocating the last of the tyrant's defiance. The choreography was merciless. There was no wasted movement. The king swung his massive head, striking Scarface, who staggered back, his vision swimming. The bloodlust whispered in the back of his mind, a low, buzzing static that begged him to tear until there was nothing left but dust. He shook his head, clearing the haze, and lunged again, driving his weight into the king's chest until the tyrant collapsed into the cooling muck. Nearby, Belphoebe watched the king go down. She turned to the hyenas. "The era of the king is dead," she muttered, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the shifting landscape. "Now we see if the brothers are kings or just butchers." Back at the water's edge, the Marsh King gasped, his eyes clouding over as the life leaked out into the dark, sodden earth. The four brothers stood over him, panting, their fur matted with the debris of the struggle. The air remained deathly silent, the birds having fled the immediate vicinity of the carnage. Scarface looked at his brothers, his chest heaving. "The territory is ours," he said, though there was no triumph in his eyes, only the grim weight of survival. "The territory is a graveyard," Hunter countered, looking at the silent expanse of the marsh, "and we are the only ones left to bury the past." Scarface looked toward the ridge, sensing a presence he couldn't name, and wondered if the voice in his head would ever be satisfied with just a throne. Scene 29, establishing the new order. The air over the Mara smelled of ozone and dried riverbed. Scarface stood atop the granite kopje, his golden eyes scanning the horizon where the fallen kings had once held court. He took a long, measured breath, the weight of the silence settling into his marrow. Beside him, Sikio was busy grooming a burr from his thick, dark mane, his movements methodical and detached. "They aren't coming back," Sikio said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the stone. "The usurpers are dead, and the scouts from the Eastern Pride have already retreated toward the thickets." Scarface didn't look at his brother. His jaw was locked, a muscle twitching near his ear, a ghost of the battle frenzy that had gripped him only hours ago. "It isn't the scouts that worry me, Sikio. It's the expectation. They see us now, and they wait for a command that I am not yet ready to give." Near the base of the ridge, Marani and Hunter were busy marking the perimeter, their paws crunching into the parched earth. They were not alone. Nearby, Belphoebe Balthazar sat among a cluster of acacia shrubs, her gaze fixed on the brothers with a mixture of cold calculation and lingering apprehension. She wasn't seeking alliance, she was assessing the cost of existence. Belphoebe shifted, her claws digging into the dirt as she watched Hunter lunging playfully, then stopping abruptly to growl at a rustle in the grass. "You look tired, Hunter," she called out, her tone sharp, stripped of any deference. "Claiming a kingdom doesn't mean you have to act like a scavenger looking for scraps." Hunter whipped his head around, his golden eyes narrowing. "We don't scavenge, Belphoebe. We dictate," he retorted, though he didn't charge. Meanwhile, deep in the tall grass a mile away, three rival males, the last of the old guard, crouched in the shadows. One, a jagged-eared veteran named Kojo, snarled silently at his companions. "They are too focused on the height of the rocks," Kojo hissed, his tail twitching in agitation. "If we strike now, while they are posturing, we catch them in the vanity of their victory." His companion, Mosey, shook his head. "Look at them. Even from here, the air ripples with the pressure they exert. You saw what happened to the kings. Do you really want to be the next legend that ends in the dirt?" Back on the kopje, Scarface finally turned, his gaze locking onto the distant shadows where he knew the rivals huddled. He didn't need to see them to feel their heartbeat. "They are watching," he murmured, his voice laced with that internal dark melody that only he could hear. "Then let them watch," Marani growled, appearing suddenly behind them, his hide matted with dust. "Let them see that the order has changed not because we demanded it, but because we are the only ones left standing." Belphoebe stood up, shaking off the lethargy of her position. She knew her independence was a precarious thing, a fragile architecture she'd built stone by stone. She began to pad toward the brothers, her movements fluid and purposeful. She wasn't joining them, but she wasn't leaving either. "If you intend to hold this, you'll need to stop looking at the horizon and start looking at the gaps in your own defense," she said, stopping just paces from the pride. Scarface stepped down from the stone, the ground seeming to tilt in response to his movement. He leveled a gaze at her, not one of affection or kinship, but of raw, tactical acknowledgement. He leaned in, his presence so heavy it forced the very wind to quiet. "The gaps are already closed," he replied, his voice a whisper that carried across the entire plain. The brothers stood in a perfect, impenetrable semicircle behind him, their collective strength a physical wall. There was no joy in this victory, only the cold, hard necessity of survival. Scarface looked at his brothers, then back to the shadows where Kojo and his cohort waited. The holdouts shifted, their resolve crumbling under the sheer, immovable weight of the musketeers' collective stare. They turned and slunk away, vanishing into the savannah without a single challenge. "The order is established," Sikio noted, letting out a sharp huff of air. Scarface watched them go, the internal voice finally quieting to a dull hum. "The order is nothing more than a pause before the next storm." Scene 30, Managing the Pride Lands. The Mara sun hung heavy, a molten gold coin pressed against the horizon, painting the savannah in shades of bruised purple and ochre. Scarface stood upon the crest of a ridge, his amber eyes tracking the dust clouds miles away. The silence of the plains was not empty. It was a pressurized chamber, vibrating with the latent power of his presence. Beside him, the air tasted of dry grass and the metallic tang of an approaching thunderstorm. "The northern corridor is thinning," Sikio remarked, his voice a low, gravelly hum that barely disrupted the quiet. He paced in a tight, agitated circle, his scarred ear twitching toward the sound of distant movement. "The herds are drifting, and if we don't tighten the perimeter, the scavengers will sense the shift." Scarface didn't look at his brother. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved from grit and resolve. "Let them drift, Sikio. Let them get comfortable. We need them to believe the borders are porous." "You play a dangerous game, Scarface," Sikio replied, his patience fraying like a worn rope. "We are kings of a hollow kingdom if we cannot secure the resources." Miles away, near the winding silt of the riverbank, Hunter and Marani stood knee-deep in the tall, amber grass, their focus fixed on a pride of nomadic scavengers attempting to encroach on a stagnant watering hole. Hunter nudged Marani, his gaze sharp and mocking. "Look at them, Marani. They think because we are busy with territory maps, they can sip our water. It is almost insulting." Marani let out a sharp, dismissive snort, his mane ruffled by the wind. "They don't have the stomach for what comes next. Let them finish their drink. It makes them heavier when we chase them back into the dust." The brothers shared a look, a silent, jagged communication that spoke of years of shared hunger and cold nights. They moved in perfect, synchronized grace, not out of fear, but out of a shared, unshakable arrogance. They were the apex, and the world was merely their training ground. Back on the ridge, Belphoebe Balthazar sat apart, watching the interaction with a cynical curl of her lip. She kept her distance, a sentinel of her own choosing. She knew the brothers viewed her as a variable, perhaps a nuisance, but she remained vital to the information flow of the plains. She shifted, her gaze lingering on the tense posture of the four musketeers. She wondered if they knew that the very bloodlust guiding their leader was beginning to manifest as a physical tremor in Scarface's left paw. Scarface finally turned, his gaze locking onto Sikio. The argument that had been simmering for hours threatened to ignite. "My strategy is not a suggestion, brother," Scarface stated, the temperature in the air dropping as he spoke. Sikio bristled, stepping closer until their shoulders brushed. "And my patrols are not optional. You lead, but you are not the only one who bleeds for this land." For a moment, the tension was a physical barrier between them, a wall of pride and exhaustion. Scarface looked at his brother, seeing the weariness etched into the lines of his face, the shared burden of their ascent. The hostility softened, replaced by a profound, wordless acknowledgement of their brotherhood. Scarface leaned in, resting his forehead briefly against Sikio's, a gesture of grounding in a volatile world. "We do not fail," Scarface whispered, his voice steadying the chaos in his own mind. "We are the only alliance that remains." Below them, Hunter let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the valley, a signal to the encroaching rivals that the peace was over. The game had shifted, and the real work of ruling had only just begun. Scarface watched the chaos unfold, wondering if the voice in his head would ever stop demanding more. Scene 30, the resistance fades away. "Is the hunger worth the inevitable silence that follows?" Scarface asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very marrow of the surrounding brush. He stood perfectly still, his scarred face a roadmap of violence, while the heat of the midday sun turned the tall grass into a furnace. Before him, a group of three young, disaffected males, Keto, Django, and Mavi, huddled near the base of a scorched acacia. They had been whispering for weeks, sowing discord among the pride's periphery. But now, faced with the monolithic presence of Scarface and his brothers, their defiance had curdled into visible tremors. Sicchio stepped forward, his eyes tracking the shifting weight of Mavi, who flickered his tail with nervous, staccato energy. "They think we don't hear the rustle of their conspiracies," Sicchio said, his tone mocking. "They think the wind carries their secrets away, but the wind here only carries the scent of their fear." Across the clearing, hidden within a dense thicket of shadows, Belphoebe Balthazar watched the tableau with narrowing eyes. She sat with her kin, watching the brothers with a mix of awe and calculated detachment. Her own subgroup, a small, independent collective of scavengers, was currently debating whether to peel away from the brothers' shadow entirely. "If the musketeers fall today, the hierarchy resets," she murmured to an elder scavenger named Vane. Vane, however, remained transfixed by the impending violence. "The musketeers aren't just leaders," Vane replied. "They are the weather. You don't revolt against a hurricane, you wait for it to pass, or you are scattered." Back in the center of the fray, Morani and Hunter flanked the rebels, cutting off any hope of a retreat. The choreography of the inevitable was brutal. Mavi lunged, hoping to catch Scarface off guard, but the lead brother sidestepped with fluid, lethal grace. Scarface lashed out, his massive paw catching Mavi across the flank, the claws leaving deep, burning furrows in the younger male's hide. Mavi collapsed, gasping, as Keto and Django hesitated, the sheer pressure of Scarface's aura locking their muscles in place. "End this," Hunter growled, moving in with a low, predatory crouch. He slammed into Keto, burying his teeth into the rival's shoulder, a sickening crunch echoing against the stillness of the savannah. The fight was less of a battle and more of an execution of authority. Sicchio pinned Django with a precision blow, his weight pressing the rebel into the dust until the fight drained entirely from his limbs. Scarface stood over the prone rebels, his chest heaving, his dark eyes flickering with that cold ancient bloodlust. He didn't kill them. He didn't need to. He simply broke their will, turning their rebellion into a memory of failure. "Brother," Morani said, breathing hard, his fur matted with the dust of the skirmish. "The message is received. They aren't going to try again." Nearby, Belphoebe watched the brothers exert their dominance, her cynicism warring with a begrudging respect. She saw the way Scarface paused, closing his eyes as if fighting an internal surge of madness, a momentary weakness that he quickly shuddered away behind a mask of absolute authority. She realized then that her dream of independence was a fragile thing, easily crushed under the weight of such singular, violent focus. "They won't try again," Scarface repeated, turning his gaze toward the horizon, his voice devoid of triumph, heavy with the burden of what he had become. "But the land is large, and there will always be another shadow waiting for us to blink." Scene 32. The lioness politics resolved. The Mara dusk hung heavy, the air thick with the scent of crushed red oats and the metallic tang of an old kill. Scarface sat upon the granite ridge, his frame casting a jagged shadow that seemed to swallow the dying light. His jaw was locked, a rhythmic twitch pulsing in his cheek, the only outward sign of the inner storm he fought to contain. Below him, the pride moved with a tentative, brittle grace. Belphoebe Balthazar paced the periphery, her amber eyes scanning the tall grass. She was not a follower, and her cynical gaze flickered toward the brothers with a mixture of begrudging respect and sharp apprehension. She did not trust the hierarchy, but she understood the arithmetic of survival. "The time for posturing has passed," Sicchio rumbled, his voice a low vibration that shook the dry earth. He nudged a recalcitrant lioness, Zola, away from the kill site. Morani and Hunter flanked him, their forms scarred and imposing, their presence acting as a physical wall against the chaos of the wild. Zola bristled, her ears pinned back. "We have sustained ourselves for seasons without the heavy hand of kings," she hissed, though her defiance lacked its usual edge. She looked at Scarface, noting the way his eyes tracked a movement in the distance, a predator far beyond their borders, sensing the shift in power. "You have survived on scraps and fear," Hunter interrupted, his tone devoid of malice but sharp as flint. "The landscape is changing. The hyena clans are emboldened by your fragmentation. You either unite under the shadow of these scars, or you disappear into the dust of the valley. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, the hyena matriarch Kessie paced the narrow ravine with her scouts, Vane and Cree. They observed the ridge from the shadows, their jagged teeth clicking in a nervous, rhythmic tempo. "The brothers have claimed the ridge," Kessie muttered, her ears twitching. "The politics of the lions have shifted. They are no longer a pride in name only. They have become a fortress." Vane spat into the dirt. "Then we strike at the edges, where the young are vulnerable," he suggested, but Kessie slapped his muzzle. "Not against them. We wait for the bloodlust to consume their reasoning. That is the only opening we will get." Back on the ridge, the integration was taking hold. Belphoebe stepped forward, her movements precise and deliberate. She stood before Scarface, refusing to avert her gaze. "I do not seek a crown," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I seek a future that does not involve bleeding out in the tall grass because of another's pride." Scarface looked down at her. The voice in his mind, that jagged, whispering demand for blood, began to drown out, replaced by the crushing weight of responsibility. He saw the scars on her flank, matching his own in spirit, if not in depth. He nodded once, a gesture of silent pact. "Then move with us," Scarface growled, his voice a gravelly command that brooked no argument. "The kingdom does not offer comfort, it offers a perimeter." Zola finally lowered her head, a slow, deliberate bow of submission. The tension in the pride dissipated, replaced by the grueling reality of shared survival. The transition was complete, born of necessity, and sealed in the language of claw and grit. As the moon rose, casting a pale, cold light over the brothers, Scarface watched the pride settle, knowing the peace was merely a prelude to the next trial. Brotherhood was their only law, and for tonight, the borders held. "We have secured the future," Marani whispered to the darkness, "but the price of this unity will be paid in the next dawn." Scene 33, defending the eastern border. "Do you truly believe they are desperate enough to cross the silt?" Hunter asked, his voice low, vibrating against the humid air of the marsh. Scarface didn't turn his head. He watched the reeds twitch near the water's edge, his golden eyes scanning the periphery for the telltale silhouette of the rogues. "Desperation is the only thing that makes a coward bold, Hunter." Scarface replied, his tone as heavy as the impending storm. Nearby, Belphoebe Balthazar sat on a sun-bleached rock, her ears swiveling to track the rhythmic splash of water approaching from the south. She didn't look at the brothers. She knew their strength was a furnace, and she was currently deciding if she wanted to be burned or shielded. She watched a pair of egrets take flight, sensing the sudden tension in the air. "They aren't just crossing," Belphoebe noted, her voice crisp and devoid of sentiment. "They are testing the structural integrity of your kingdom." Suddenly, the water erupted. 4 massive, battle-scarred rogues surged from the marsh, their manes matted with dark algae. They did not wait for a challenge. They lunged for the brothers, claws bared. The conflict was immediate. Sikio met the first rogue midair, a collision of muscle and fur that sounded like timber snapping. Marani followed, pinning a second attacker against a fallen log, his teeth sinking into the rogue's shoulder with a sickening crunch. Scarface moved with a fluid, terrifying precision. He didn't roar, he simply intercepted the leader, a beast with a notched ear and hollow eyes. Scarface slammed his weight forward, forcing the rogue into the mud. He swiped with lethal accuracy, the claw catching the intruder's flank and sending a spray of crimson into the murky water. A few hundred yards away, the hyena matriarch Gara watched from a ridge, her pack panting in the heat. "Wait for the blood to flow more freely," she hissed to her scouts, her eyes fixed on the display of power. She was not interested in the brothers' territory, not yet, but she was obsessed with the inventory of their weaknesses. One of her younger kin, Mako, paced nervously. "They are too fast, Gara. Look at how Scarface moves. It's like he knows where they will strike before they even tighten their muscles." Gara merely bared her teeth, a silent promise of future treachery. Back at the riverbank, Hunter swung his massive paw, clipping the third rogue across the jaw and sending him sprawling into the shallows. The rogue tried to scramble up the bank, but Hunter was there, pinning the beast's tail to the earth and forcing a yelp of submission. Scarface stood over his opponent, his chest heaving, his gaze locked onto the rogue's terror-stricken eyes. The voice in his head roared, a phantom demand for total destruction, but he checked the impulse. He simply pinned the intruder by the neck, his aura so crushing that the rogue stopped struggling, his breath hitching in a strangled whine. "The border is closed," Scarface growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the insects in the nearby brush. He released the rogue, who scrambled backward, limbs shaking, fleeing toward the dry plains without a backward glance. The musketeers regrouped, their flanks heaving, the stench of copper and swamp water thick in the air. Belphoebe stood from her rock, observing the aftermath with a calculating tilt of her head. She saw the way the brothers stood in a perfect arc, impenetrable and absolute. She knew that to align with them was to surrender the luxury of her own path, yet the sheer, suffocating gravity of their dominance made the alternative standing alone against such chaos seem like a fool's errand. "They won't be back," Scipio panted, wiping mud from his brow. Scarface watched the intruders vanish into the horizon. "They will be back," he said, his eyes darkening with the weight of his secret burden. "But they will arrive with more fear than they had today." He looked toward the horizon, wondering if the bloodlust he felt was truly his own, or if it was merely the price of maintaining a throne in a world that only respected the blade. Scene 34. Reflecting on the path. The Mara River hummed a low, subterranean vibration, its silt-heavy waters churning against the reeds like liquid obsidian. Scarface stood atop the Olololo escarpment, his golden amber eyes tracing the jagged horizon where the heat shimmered, distorted and wild. The deep, jagged scar that bisected his right eye caught the fading light, turning from pale gray to a blood-slicked crimson. "The mud still holds the scent of that first flood," Scipio said, his voice a gravelly rasp that vibrated in his thick chest. He stepped up beside his brother, his own mane matted with burrs and dried earth. "Do you remember? We were little more than shivering heaps of fur, barely able to keep our heads above the silt." Scarface let out a breath that sounded like a bellows. "I remember the water tasted like iron, and the terror was so loud it drowned out the crickets." He turned his head, looking toward Marani and Hunter, who sat a few yards away, their massive bodies hunched in a rare moment of stillness. Hunter, the youngest, was methodically licking a fresh gash on his shoulder, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "We are not those cubs anymore," Marani grunted, flicking his tail to swat away a persistent fly. "I killed a bull giraffe this morning that stood twice as high as my father ever did. We have mastered this dirt. Every claw mark we leave is a map of our dominion." Across the marsh, hidden within a dense thicket of yellow bark acacia, Belphoebe Balthazar watched the four brothers. Her movements were fluid, predatory, and entirely calculated. She sat with a group of nomadic lionesses, observing the kings of the marsh with a mixture of awe and cold, detached suspicion. "They won't look at us," one of the younger lionesses whispered, her ears twitching with agitation. "They act as if the entire world is merely their hunting ground." Belphoebe narrowed her gaze. "That is because to them it is. They aren't looking at us because they are busy listening to the wind. There is a bloodlust in them that isn't just about hunger, it is a craving for the crown." She stood, her spine rippling with power, and paced in a tight circle. "We watch, we wait. If they trip, we take the territory. If they don't, we make sure they stay hungry enough to keep moving." Back on the ridge, the brothers shared a silent, profound understanding. Hunter stopped licking his shoulder and stood, looking at Scarface with a piercing, earnest intensity. "The voice?" Hunter whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Does it still speak, brother?" Scarface felt the phantom static crawl up the back of his neck, the cold, intoxicating whisper that urged him toward ruin, toward a legacy written in gore. He felt the weight of his brother's gaze, a heavy, tethering presence that pulled him back from the edge of madness. He reached out, pressing his massive, scarred forehead against Scipio's, the touch brief, rough, and vibrating with the history of a decade spent surviving. It was an acknowledgement of their brotherhood, a silent promise that the blood they had spilled would never be theirs. "It speaks," Scarface murmured, his voice tight with the strain of holding the darkness at bay. "But tonight, it is silent. Tonight, we simply exist as who we have become." "We are the kings," Marani declared, his eyes flashing with pride. "Let the marsh tremble. We have earned every gilded scar we carry." Scarface looked toward the dark expanse of their kingdom, his heart hammering against his ribs, finally understanding that survival was not the goal, it was merely the foundation upon which their empire was built. The path behind them was littered with the ghosts of their enemies, but the path ahead was quiet, waiting for their next command. "Tomorrow," Scarface said, his gaze hardening as the moonlight hit the savannah, "the world will know exactly what it means to stand in our shadows." Scene 35, a moment of peace. The high ridge of the Olulolo escarpment was bathed in the bruised purple of an oncoming dusk. Scarface stood at the precipice, his breath hitching, not from exhaustion, but from the relentless, maddening hum of the voice in his skull. It whispered of red clay and hot copper, of the next fight, the next conquest. He shook his heavy, scarred head, his mane catching the dying light like strands of burnt amber. "The wind is holding its breath," Scipio said, his voice a low gravel, stepping up to flank his brother. Scarface didn't turn. "It's waiting for us to make a mistake." "We don't make mistakes," Marani added, coming to rest on Scarface's left. Hunter arrived a moment later, flopping down into the tall, dry grass with a huff that sounded like a bellows. The Brotherhood was a singular, terrifying entity here, a knot of muscle and history that held the valley in a state of suspended animation. Below, at the watering hole, Belphebe Balthazar kept her distance. She watched the four brothers from the shadows of an ancient acacia, her amber eyes narrowed. She was a ghost in her own territory, choosing to survive by proximity rather than submission. Beside her, a young, skittish leopard named Django paced, his tail twitching rhythmically. "They look tired, Belle," Django whispered, his voice sharp with nerves. "If the river prides knew, they wouldn't just be watching from the reeds." Belphebe bared her teeth slightly, a silent warning to the youth. "They are never tired, Django. They are practicing stillness. It is a trap for the foolish." In the tall grass, Hunter nudged Scarface's shoulder with his nose. "The herd of buffalo at the crossing, they've stopped moving. They sense us, even from this far." Scarface let out a long, shuddering sigh. The bloodlust in his head dulled to a manageable ache. "Let them wait. Tonight, we listen to the silence." Meanwhile, 3 miles east, a rival coalition of 2 aging nomadic lions, Kojo and Becky, scavenged the remains of a zebra kill. They were gaunt, their ribs pressed hard against their tawny skin. Mbeki looked toward the ridge, his ears flattened. "The wind carries their scent," Mbeki said, tearing a strip of hide with agonizing effort. "They have consolidated the west. If we cross the river, we don't return." Kojo let out a ragged, humorless laugh. "Then we starve where we stand. A slow death or a sharp one, Becky. The musketeers don't offer us a third choice." Back at the ridge, the brothers shared a moment of profound, wordless connection. They shifted their weight, eyes scanning the horizon for the slightest twitch of movement. Scarface's paws dug into the dirt, feeling the tremors of the earth. He looked toward the acacia tree where Belphebe stood. He knew she was there. He knew where every living thing in the valley breathed, but he chose not to acknowledge her. She was a variable he was not yet ready to solve. "The moon will be full soon," Hunter remarked, looking up at the brightening sky. "It will make the hunting easier." "Or the dying," Scipio corrected, his gaze fixed on the distant, flickering fireflies. Scarface finally turned to his brothers. His face was a map of past violence, his left eye obscured by the jagged, iconic scar that had earned him his name. "We are the silence before the storm," he said, his voice barely a rasp, "and we are the storm itself. Never forget that." As the last sliver of sun vanished, the valley descended into a watchful, dangerous stillness, the calm before the next inevitable strike. Scene 36, Scavenger Network Legacy. The dust of the southern plains tasted of copper and old iron. Marani paced the perimeter of the acacia grove, his heavy paws pressing deep into the sun-baked earth, feeling the phantom vibrations of 1,000 scurrying hooves. "If the scouts fail, we are blind," he thought, the weight of the musketeer's legend pressing against his ribs like a physical burden. He stopped, his ears swiveling to catch the jagged, frantic chatter of a red-billed oxpecker landing on a nearby termite mound. "The migration is shifting, Marani," the bird chirped, its tone sharp with terror. "The coalition to the west has stopped feeding. They are hungry, and they know you are distracted. Marani didn't look at the bird. He stared into the tall, golden grass. Hunger makes kings foolish. Tell them the cost of a step across our border is a life. Keep watching. A mile away, in the shadow of a basalt ridge, Belphoebe Balthazar observed the interaction from a hidden cranny. She was not a lion, but she had become a ghost in their periphery, a survivalist who had learned that proximity to the musketeers meant safety, even if it cost her every shred of her solitude. She watched as a pair of hyenas, unauthorized scouts, slipped through the tall grass, hoping to map the brothers' sleeping patterns. "They're moving toward the watering hole," whispered Pip, a nervous jackal who had been tasked by Marani to report on the scavenger network. "They think they're invisible." Belphoebe narrowed her eyes, watching the hyenas flank the path where Hunter, the youngest musketeer, usually patrolled. "They aren't invisible," she replied, her voice low and steady. "They're just bait. Marani wants them to see what they expect to see." Back at the grove, Hunter emerged from the brush, his coat matted with the dry remnants of a morning scuffle. He looked at Marani and nodded. The silent communication was absolute. No words were needed. Hunter moved toward the hyenas, not with a roar, but with a terrifying, calculated silence. The hyena lead scout, a jagged-eared veteran of the border wars, let out a startled yip as Hunter burst from the shadows. The combat was instantaneous and violent. Hunter landed a heavy paw on the lead hyena's spine, pinning him before the creature could turn. With a swift, precise motion, he sent the intruder sprawling, blood blossoming in the dust. The other hyena darted left, only to run straight into the path of Sikio, who emerged from behind a boulder like a titan of slate and muscle. Sikio's strike was a blur, a thunderous swipe that sent the hyena crashing into the thorny brush. "They talk of us in the dark," Sikio rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Let them talk in fear." Marani joined them, his gaze scanning the horizon. The wilderness was quiet now, the scavenger network having relayed the defeat of the scouts deep into the territory. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "It is not enough to be strong," Marani said, looking at the wreckage of the fight. "We must be the thing the shadows fear most." Belphoebe watched from the ridge, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified of the power they wielded, yet she knew, with a cynicism that burned cold, that there was no other safety in this broken land. She turned away, disappearing into the scrub, her presence acknowledged by a singular sharp look from Scarface, who had been watching the entire exchange from the high ground above. Scarface stood still as a statue, the internal voice, that cold, driving whisper of bloodlust, urging him to hunt further, to expand, to break the world to his will. He suppressed it, focusing instead on the brotherhood standing beneath him. They were the only reality that mattered. "The legacy is set," Scarface declared, his voice echoing across the plain, "and the cost of rebellion is only just beginning." The final test of strength. The dust of the Serengeti settled into the raw, inflamed tissue of a fresh puncture wound on Scarface's flank. He stood motionless, his amber eyes locked not on the physical form of the rogue lion before him, but on the shifting horizon where his inner voice, that cold, metallic whisper of bloodlust, urged him to strike. He resisted. He was the anchor. If he moved, the balance shattered. Across from him, Titan, a massive rogue with a mane matted in clay and burrs, paced a tight, frantic circle. Titan's tail lashed against his own hocks, a rhythmic thwack against bone. "You look tired, Scar," Titan rasped, his voice a jagged saw. "The crown sits heavy on a neck that's seen too many winters." Scarface didn't blink. His posture was deliberate, a statue carved from obsidian. He didn't even shift his weight. "The crown isn't heavy for those born to carry it," Scarface replied, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very pebbles at their feet. Nearby, hiding behind a screen of feverthorn, Sikio and Marani watched with held breaths. Sikio nudged Marani's shoulder, his eyes wide. "He isn't going to engage," Sikio whispered, his fur bristling. "Look at him. He's doing it again. He's letting his presence do the killing." Marani flicked his ears, his gaze darting toward the distant scrub where Belphoebe Balthazar sat, watching the confrontation from a ridge. She was calculating, her tail twitching in rhythmic annoyance. She hated this, the waiting, the theater of it, but she knew if Scarface fell, her own precarious neutrality would vanish. Titan surged forward, claws unsheathed and tearing through the dry earth. He let out a primal, guttural roar that flattened the nearby tall grass, but the sound died in the air as he reached the 10-foot mark. Scarface didn't flinch. He didn't even drop his head. He simply expanded his chest, his golden eyes narrowing into thin, predatory slits. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and iron. Titan stopped dead, his front paws skidding in the dirt. He wheezed, the bravado draining from his posture like water from a cracked vessel. "I have killed greater kings," Titan stammered, though his voice lacked conviction. He took a staggering step backward, his hackles going flat. "Then your history is a lie," Scarface growled, taking one slow, tectonic step forward. The ground seemed to groan under the pressure of his intent. At the ridge, Belphoebe shifted, her claws digging into the stone. She muttered to herself, "He is a monster, but he is a calculated one. If he forces a retreat without drawing blood, he saves his own strength for the tyrants." She turned her head, noticing two of the rival pride's younger scouts watching from the brush. They were trembling. They saw what she saw, a king who didn't need to fight to win. Titan let out a pathetic, stifled whine. The intimidation was absolute. The rogue's knees knocked together, and he dropped his belly to the dust, exposing his throat in a frantic, undignified display of total submission. "I seek only exile," Titan whimpered, his eyes fixed on the dirt. "Spare me, and the northern plains will never see my shadow again." Scarface stood over him, a mountain of scarred muscle and terrifying silence. He looked down at the broken challenger, the bloodlust inside him screaming for a swift, lethal conclusion. Scarface took a long, measured breath, closing his eyes for a heartbeat. "Go," Scarface commanded, his voice cold as a winter wind. "Before I decide, your life has no further value." As Titan scrambled away, scrambling into the thicket with his tail tucked tight, the brothers emerged from the shadows. Marani stepped up, his expression one of weary relief. "That was close," he grunted. "The others are watching from the tall grass, Scar. They see the power, but they fear the man behind the mask." Scarface turned his head, watching the dust kick up in Titan's wake. "Let them fear," he said, his gaze flickering toward the ridge where Belphoebe still watched. "Fear is the only currency they understand." Scene 38. Securing the next generation. The dry season wind whipped across the savannah, carrying the scent of parched earth and the metallic tang of distant, impending storms. Scarface stood atop the granite kopje, his golden eyes scanning the horizon where the heat shimmer distorted the swaying grass. Internally, the familiar, velvet-toned voice whispered of conquest and the fragility of peace, a siren song of bloodlust he fought to suppress with every rhythmic beat of his heart. Suddenly, a thrashing sound erupted from the thicket below. Scarface launched himself from the ledge, landing with a heavy thud that rattled the loose shale. He didn't hesitate. Before him, a rogue leopard, a lean, scarred veteran named Kalen, was closing in on one of the younger cubs. Scarface moved like a blur of corded muscle, intercepting the leopard mid-pounce. "Step aside, King," Kalen hissed, his claws extended, shredding the dirt. Scarface let out a low, guttural vibration that seemed to drain the color from the air. "The cubs are the future," Scarface growled, his voice a gravelly command. "You are merely a memory, fading into the dust." The fight was violent and instantaneous. Scarface pivoted, avoiding a raking blow to his flank, and countered with a thunderous swipe that sent the leopard spinning into a patch of wait-a-bit thorns. Sicchio and Marani appeared from the brush within seconds, flank guards moving in perfect synchronicity, their mere presence forcing the leopard to abandon his hunt and scramble up a nearby acacia. Meanwhile, a mile away, Belphoebe Balthazar sat by the riverbank, watching the water ripple with the stealthy movement of a crocodile. She was not alone. The elder lioness, Zola, paced the mudflats, her tail flicking with rhythmic irritation. Zola looked at Belphoebe and grunted, "The brothers think they are gods, but they are merely hammers. They don't know how to mend the cracks they create in the pride." Belphoebe narrowed her eyes, her gaze sharp and analytical. "They don't need to mend," she replied, her tone cynical yet observant. "They simply need to be the only thing standing between the cubs and the void. If you want independence, Zola, start by teaching the young ones how to hide when the ground shakes. Don't rely on the brothers to always be the shield." Back at the kopje, Hunter was corralling the cubs toward the safety of the dens. He nudged a stumbling youngster, his expression uncharacteristically soft, though his eyes remained glued to the surrounding grass. "You want to survive?" Hunter called out to the cluster of young lions. "Then learn the rhythm of the wind. If it stops, you run. If it screams, you fight." Scarface watched them from a distance, feeling the weight of his legacy. The tension in the air wasn't just from the leopard. It was the realization that his bloodlust was a tool he had to master, not a master he had to serve. "Do you hear it?" Sikio asked, leaning against Scarface, the two brothers sharing the silent, grounded comfort of their lifelong pact. "I hear everything," Scarface replied, his gaze returning to the cubs, who were now practicing pouncing on stalks of dry grass with earnest, clumsy intensity. "But today, the only thing that matters is that they live to hunt another moon." The sky darkened, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, washing away the scent of the struggle and promising a night where the pride and the brothers would remain, for one more cycle, the undisputed masters of the wild. "They are learning," Belphebe murmured from the shadows of the ravine, watching the brothers stand guard, "but they have no idea what is coming for them when the storm finally breaks." Scene 39, Legacy of the Kings. The sun hung low over the savannah, bleeding gold across the dry, cracked earth of the central plateau. Scarface stood at the jagged edge of the escarpment, his massive mane matted with the dust of 1,000 skirmishes. He stared at the horizon, his breath coming in rhythmic, heavy rasps. Internally, the voice, that cold, sharp whisper of bloodlust, had finally quieted, replaced by the deafening silence of a land that no longer feared his shadow. Sikio sat to his left, licking a deep, jagged furrow in his shoulder where a rival king's claw had nearly ended him days ago. "The border is quiet," Sikio murmured, his gaze fixed on the plains below. "Too quiet." Scarface let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound that carried no aggression, only acknowledgement. "It is the quiet of absolute law, brother." Marani paced a few yards away, his tail flicking with a restless energy that betrayed his inability to fully accept peace. He nudged Hunter, who was lying flat, eyes closed, savoring the warmth of the fading light. "Tell him," Marani grunted, nudging Hunter's flank with a heavy paw. "Tell him we're still ready for the next wave." Hunter cracked one eye open, the amber iris gleaming with earned wisdom. "The only wave left is the wind, Marani. Let it rest." Miles away, near the riverbank, Belphebe Balthazar stood guard over a small grove of acacia. She watched a group of hyenas, the remnants of the old, broken clan, scavenging in the tall grass. They kept their heads low, eyes darting toward the plateau, terrified of the scent carrying on the breeze. She caught the eye of Zola, a younger hyena who had once been defiant. Zola immediately tucked her tail and retreated, choosing the shadows over a confrontation. Belphebe exhaled, her cynical posture relaxing just a fraction. She had survived by being smarter than the chaos, and now, for the first time, her independence didn't feel like a lonely burden. It felt like a tactical victory. Back on the ridge, the brothers gathered in a tight circle. Scarface looked at each of them, the broken teeth, the mangled ears, the scars that mapped their journey from cubs shivering in a rain-drenched thicket to the undisputed kings of this expanse. "We are the only ones left," Scarface said, his voice a low rumble. Marani looked at the horizon, his jaw tight. "And we are the only ones who matter." Sikio leaned in, resting his heavy head against Scarface's neck, a rare, uncharacteristic display of brotherhood that transcended their usual stoic posturing. "The voice?" Sikio asked quietly, almost too low for the wind to catch. "Is it gone?" Scarface watched the sun dip below the earth, the red glow reflecting in his scarred, battle-worn face. He felt the weight of their legacy, the finality of their conquest. He thought of the battles, the blood, the frantic scrambles for survival in the riverbeds, and the sheer, brutal necessity of their rise. "It is gone," Scarface whispered, not to his brothers, but to the memory of the struggle itself. "Only the crown remains." As the last light vanished, leaving the savannah in a cool, silver dusk, the brothers stood shoulder to shoulder. They had carved order out of the madness, and in the stillness they finally understood that the true prize wasn't the territory they owned, but the fact that they still stood, side by side, amidst the ruins of the world they had broken and rebuilt. "Whatever comes next," Hunter said, closing his eyes again, "we have already won the only war that mattered." Scene 40, the marsh under control. The marsh breathed in rhythm with the sun, a humid expanse of papyrus reeds and stagnant gold-flecked water. Scarface lay atop a termite mound, the heavy crown of his mane matted with the dry mud of victory. He stared at his own reflection in a pool of brackish water, searching for the monster he feared resided behind his eyes. The voice is quiet now, he thought, his tail flicking to swat a persistent tsetse fly. But the land is silent, and silence is merely a lull before the next eruption. Nearby, Sikio and Hunter were engaged in a rough, brotherly wrestling match, their bodies thudding against the earth with a percussive force that sent a flock of egrets screaming into the sky. Morani sat apart, his amber eyes tracking a distant, nervous herd of buffalo at the marsh's edge. "They still watch us," Morani grumbled, his voice like grinding gravel. "Even when we aren't hunting, they tremble. It's an exhausting legacy to carry, brothers." Scarface stood, his joints popping, and nudged Morani's shoulder with his nose, a gesture of grounding, of shared weight. "Let them tremble," Scarface said. "It keeps the grass short and the borders clear." 2 miles away, near the jagged limestone cliffs, Belphoebe Balthazar stood watch over the scattered remains of the old regime's pride. She was a leopard of singular biting wit, her coat a mosaic of rosettes that seemed to shift with the dappled light. She watched a hyena scavenger, Missouri, tentatively sniffing the air near the musketeers' kill zone. Missouri chattered nervously, looking for a way to slip past the lion's scent markers. Belphoebe chuffed, a sharp, mocking sound. "You'll find nothing but dust and regret, Missouri," she called out, stepping from the shadows of a baobab tree. Missouri jumped, her tail tucked between her legs. "The musketeers have left the kill, Balthazar. Surely there is a scrap for the patient?" "They left the kill because they are bored of the taste," Belphoebe said, her movements fluid and devoid of fear. "If you value your pelt, you will stay on your side of the salt pan. They are not in the mood for scavengers, and I am not in the mood to listen to your whining if they decide to turn you into a cautionary tale." Back at the termite mound, the atmosphere shifted. Scarface looked at his brothers, a sudden, piercing vulnerability crossing his face as he slumped slightly. The bloodlust he had suppressed felt like a physical weight, a phantom limb he couldn't stop reaching for. "I did not think we would survive the winter," he whispered, a rare admission of uncertainty. Sikio stopped mid-wrestle, his ears pinned back. "We didn't survive, Scar. We conquered. There is a difference." "The difference is measured in scars," Hunter added, licking a deep, jagged gash along his flank. "And we have plenty to show for the years spent chasing the horizon." They moved into a tight huddle, a physical manifestation of their unbreakable bond, resting their chins upon one another's shoulders in the fading heat. It was a moment of profound wordless connection, the scent of dry earth, the heavy musk of lion, and the quiet satisfaction of a territory finally forged in iron. They were no longer the lost, frightened cubs of the flood. They were the apex of the wild, and for the first time in an eternity, the voice in Scarface's head was silenced by the steady, synchronized breathing of his kin. "We stay here," Scarface murmured, his gaze sweeping over the marsh one last time, not as kings waiting to be overthrown, but as the land itself. The end.